In the year 1266, a baker in Paris was dragged from his shop and thrown into a cell beneath the city. His crime was not theft, not treason, not heresy. He had baked bread, but not the right kind of bread, before factory floors, before machinery, before steel mills and steam engines hummed through the night. Bread was not simple. It was not just food. It was identity. It was class. It was survival. And in medieval Europe, the bread you ate told the world exactly who you were. This is the story they don't tell you. The one hidden in old guild laws and forgotten court records. The one that shows how something as ordinary as bread became a tool of power, a mark of status, and a reason men went to war. By the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval bread was never just bread, and why, for most people, it was something they could barely afford to eat. Imagine a city at dawn. The year is somewhere in the 1300s. The streets are narrow, stone, wet from the night. The first light touches the rooftops, and from below, you hear it. The sound of a millstone grinding grain. It echoes through alleys, through courtyards, through the walls of wooden houses stacked against each other like books on a crooked shelf. Everyone hears it. Everyone knows what it means. Today, there will be bread. But how much? And for whom? That depends on something most people today never think about. Something medieval Europe never stopped thinking about. Grain. Not money. Not land. Not even livestock. Grain was the foundation of medieval life. Wheat, rye, barley, oats. Without it, there was nothing. No bread, no porridge, no ale, no survival. And grain was never guaranteed. One bad harvest, one flooded field, one cold spring, and entire regions starved. So bread became more than nutrition. It became strategy. It became law. It became the center of a complicated system designed to control who ate, what they ate, and how much they paid for it. The system began with the grain itself. In most medieval towns, you could not simply grind your own wheat. You were required by law to use the Lord's mill, his stones, his price. This was called the ban of the mill, a feudal right. You brought your grain. You paid a portion of it as a fee, and if you tried to grind your grain at home with a hand quern, you could be fined, or worse. The same rule applied to baking. In many places, you could not bake your own bread in your own oven. You had to use the communal oven, the Lord's oven. Again, you paid. Again, you had no choice. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was control. Control of resources. Control of production. Control of survival. Because bread was not just food. It was currency. It was wages. It was taxation. When a laborer worked in the fields, he was often paid in bread. When a soldier marched with an army, his ration was bread. When a monastery fed the poor, it gave bread. But not all bread was the same. Walk into a medieval bakery, and you would see loaves in different shapes, different weights, different colors. White bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour. Light, soft, expensive. This was manchet, the bread of lords, of bishops, of kings. Then came maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, coarser, denser, darker. This was the bread of merchants, of guild members, of those who could afford something better than survival. And then, at the bottom, came the bread most people ate: rye bread, barley bread, oat bread, sometimes mixed with peas or beans. Heavy, hard, dark as wet soil. This was the bread of laborers, of peasants, of anyone who worked with their hands. It was filling. It kept you alive. But it was not chosen. It was assigned by birth. The color of your bread was the color of your life, and the system made sure you could not change it. In 1202, the City of London passed a law called the Assize of Bread. It was one of the first attempts to regulate the price and weight of bread across an entire city. The law was simple in theory. It tied the price of bread to the price of grain. When grain was cheap, bread had to be cheap. When grain was expensive, bread could cost more. But bakers were not allowed to profit beyond a fixed margin. The law also dictated exactly how much a loaf should weigh based on its type. White bread, wheat bread, rye bread. Each had a standard. Each had inspectors. And the penalty for cheating was severe. If a baker sold underweight bread, he could be fined, publicly shamed, dragged through the streets with the offending loaf tied around his neck. This was called the pillory of the baker. It was not symbolic. It was public humiliation designed to protect the people from fraud, because bread was too important to be left to greed. But the system had another side. While bakers were tightly controlled, millers were watched even more closely. Millers held the first step in the process. They controlled the grain. And grain was power. There were constant accusations. Millers keeping too much flour for themselves. Millers mixing sawdust or chalk into the grain. Millers charging illegal fees. Some of these accusations were true. Some were not. But the fear was always there. Because if the miller cheated you, the baker could not make honest bread. And if the baker could not make honest bread, the city starved. So medieval towns created guilds, organizations of bakers, organizations of millers, each with rules, each with inspectors, each with oaths. The guilds controlled quality. They controlled competition. They controlled who could bake and who could not. To become a baker, you needed years of training. You needed approval. You needed money. And once you were in, you followed the rules, or you lost everything. But the system was not perfect, because even with laws, even with guilds, even with inspectors, bread was still a weapon. In 1315, the rain began. It fell across Europe, through spring, through summer, through autumn. It did not stop. Fields flooded. Grain rotted into the mud. Livestock drowned. And by winter, the stores were empty. This was the beginning of the Great Famine. For 7 years, Europe starved. In the cities, bread became scarce, then expensive, then impossible to find. People rioted. They broke into bakeries. They attacked grain stores. They accused millers and bakers of hoarding. Some accusations were true. Some bakers did hide flour. Some millers did sell grain to the highest bidder, while the poor went hungry. But most bakers were trapped in the same system. They had no grain to buy, no flour to bake, no bread to sell. And when they did have bread, the price was so high that only the wealthy could afford it. The poor ate what they could find: bark, roots, grass, anything that filled the stomach. Children died. The old died. Entire villages disappeared. And when the rain finally stopped, when the fields finally dried, the memory remained. Bread was never just bread again, because everyone understood now. Whoever controlled the grain controlled survival. And that power would shape the next 3 centuries. In England, laws were passed to control the export of grain. If the harvest was poor, grain could not leave the country, even if foreign buyers offered gold. In France, royal officials monitored the price of bread in every major city. Bakers were required to mark their loaves with a stamp, a signature, so that any fraud could be traced back to the source. In the Holy Roman Empire, grain storage became a matter of state. Cities built massive granaries. Stone warehouses guarded day and night. The message was clear. Bread was too important to be left to chance, and it was too important to be equal. Even in times of plenty, the hierarchy remained. White bread for the rich. Dark bread for the poor. You could not buy your way up. You could not bake your way out. Because the bread you ate was not just about money. It was about who you were. And in medieval Europe, that never changed. But something else was changing. Slowly, quietly. Across the countryside, new mills were being built. Water mills, peasant mills. Machines that could grind more grain, faster, with fewer workers. New ovens were being designed. Larger, hotter, more efficient. And in the cities, population was growing. Demand was rising. The old system was straining under the weight of its own rules. By the 1500s, the world of medieval bread was beginning to crack. Trade routes expanded. Grain moved across borders. New crops arrived from distant lands. And with them came new ideas, new methods, new possibilities. The guilds tried to hold on. They tightened their rules. They punished outsiders. They defended their monopolies, but the future was already here. Because bread, like everything else, was no longer local. It was global, and the power it once held in the hands of kings and lords was starting to slip. Not quickly, not dramatically, but inevitably. Today, bread is everywhere. It costs almost nothing. You can buy it in a bag, pre-sliced, pre-wrapped, ready to eat. You do not think about the grain. You do not think about the miller. You do not think about the baker's oath, or the weight of the loaf, or the color of the crumb. You do not think about who controlled it, or why it mattered. But for 1,000 years, bread was the center of everything. It was wages. It was power. It was survival. It was identity. And the system that controlled it shaped the world we live in now. Not in obvious ways, not in ways we talk about, but in the bones of cities, in the roots of laws, in the memory of what it meant to be hungry, and to have no choice. History does not disappear. It does not shout from the past. It waits, quietly, on the table,